You don't always have to be an expert, although you do have to be good at discerning what you're getting back
Yes.
to see whether or not it's making sense. So I think there still is a need for fact checking, for using multiple sources. It's just that when it does something that's right, it's often going to give you some good insights that allow you to hit the ground faster than if you had to reassemble it all yourself.
Welcome to Embracing Digital Transformation, where we investigate effective change leveraging people, process, and technology. This is Darren Pulsipher, Chief Solution Architect, author, and most importantly, your host. On today's episode, Generative AI and Computer Science Education with special guest Dr. Doug Schmidt. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Darren. Good to be here.
And we've been trying to set this up for some time, and then, I had to go and have open heart surgery, and that kind of put a kibosh on things. But I'm glad we're talking. Very fascinating. We had dinner. What was that? 3 months ago, something. And I was really fascinated with some of the work that you've done in education, especially in computer science around generative AI, and how are you teaching? There's a whole bunch of questions we'll get to, but before we get there, Doug, my audience loves to know who I'm interviewing, what your backstory is. I always say every superhero has a backstory. What is Doug's backstory so we can claim you as a superhero?
Well, I wasn't born on Krypton, and
That's good.
so that I wasn't struck by lightning in a lab and so on. But I've been a professor of computer science now since, oh gosh, 30 years. The middle 1990s is when I first got my start. I had been a
Man.
graduate student before then in computer science, and I've done a whole bunch of other things in the middle. But I think today we'll focus primarily on research and teaching, particularly as pertains to generative AI and how that's helping to transform education, defense, healthcare, law, you name it. There's something that's going to be impacted very rapidly in this wonderful emerging world of generative AI.
So in the 30 years that you've taught, would you say that this is probably one of the most profound changes in computer science that you're seeing with generative AI, or have you seen other big, huge shifts or paradigm shifts in the industry as well?
This is certainly one of the biggest. The other big change, of course, occurred when I first became a professor back in the mid 90s, which was the rise of the internet and the World Wide Web. Of course, the internet had been around for a while, but it really got its acceleration, its steroid boost in the mid 90s when we saw things coming out like Mosaic and Netscape and all the other technologies that rolled out around that time. So that was very transformational. Obviously, the advent of smartphones and mobile devices in the 2008 to 2010 timeframe, really hitting the market with iPhone and Android. That was very transformational, very disruptive. But I think if you take a look at the changes over the past 40 years, probably nothing has been so profound and rapid in its transformative and disruptive capabilities as the emergence of generative AI.
I agree. I did compare it a couple times to email back in the 90s, and it completely changed business landscape. There used to be typing pools. There used to be memos that would be sent out, and copy machines, and a lot of that stuff has disappeared, and now we rely on email for our primary communication. But this is even bigger, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons why it's big is because it helps to augment human creativity and help change the way we interact with each other, the way we interact with ourselves in profound ways that really weren't matched with the previous transformations. For example, let's use the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web and search, for example, were quite
They're
transformative
huge.
in
Yeah.
terms of being able to give people access to semi-curated information. If you wanted to know about some topic, you'd do a search of some kind, and you'd get back a bunch of links that someone had deemed relevant to you. And that's great. And that was quite a big change. It also, of course, encouraged people to broaden their horizons. It also encouraged students often to get help from places they probably shouldn't have gotten help from. But what's so interesting about generative AI is you can use it as kind of a newer form of search. That's kind of maybe the first people's way of accessing and
Right.
interacting with it. But it's really so much more than that because it provides digested information in ways that were difficult to achieve when you did a search in the web, because you'd get back links, but then you still had to peruse them to figure out what was really relevant and what wasn't, try to separate wheat from chaff or information from disinformation and so on.
Right. So you're right. A Gen AI will sift through all that and then give its opinion. Does it have an opinion? I guess it does. It's opinionated. Give you opinion on what to do. Like trying to, I did a Chat GPT search because I'm brining a turkey. I said, hey, I have these ingredients. Tell me, does this make sense? And before I would spend hours searching through lots of different recipes, and now it gave me a base and a couple links that I can go look at. And wow, it's so much faster, and I don't have to be an expert anymore.
You don't always have to be an expert, although you do have to be good at discerning what you're getting back
Yes.
to see whether or not it's making sense. So I think there still is a need for fact checking, for using multiple sources. It's just that when it does something that's right, it's often going to give you some good insights that allow you to hit the ground faster than if you had to reassemble it all yourself.
All right, so that brings up an interesting point or aspect. You've been teaching for 30 years. Gen AI hits. We're coming up on its second anniversary, or it just happened, November 30th, right? Um, how has this changed teaching? How has it changed your students? Because now, especially computer science, first off, any good computer science student already has a GitHub account and knows how to search, um, right? But now, holy cow, Gen AI, I can give it the program that I need to write, the language, and it'll spit a bunch of stuff out that may or may not compile or run. How in the world are you able to teach in this new environment with Gen AI?
So I personally think this is a wonderful evolution. However, it doesn't come without a fair amount of requirement on users to be savvy and to learn how to use the tools properly. So when we started, again, about 2 years ago, is about the time I really got involved with this. We first used it primarily to, I personally used it for helping to improve the assignments that I was creating. I used it to help with my grading. I record all my lectures. I have some 3,000 videos on my YouTube channel. So I have a huge tranche of material I've created. And when I videotape all my classes, I would use the material in conjunction with the various plugins for Chrome, such as Glasp, in order to be able to go back and extract summaries of the lectures from my spoken transcript. I would come up with ways of getting quiz questions. I would find ways to help my students prepare for quizzes by using ChatGPT. In this case, it could be other LLMs, of course, but ChatGPT, in order to interact with the material I was creating for my class. I actually, with one of my grad students, created a grading facility that helped grade and assess programming assignments using, again, ChatGPT to help get a better way of assessing whether the students were following the rubric that we were intending them to follow. So I've used it for quite a bit of things. I also used it, quite honestly, in the early days, 2 years ago, to be better at teaching topics I had not until that point felt comfortable trying to master. So I was teaching a course on scalable microservices. Gee, what a concept! One that I think you're taking
Yeah,
over
yeah,
from
I
me, which
am.
is great.
Yeah.
And at the time, I knew quite a bit about concurrency. I knew quite a bit about programming with mobile devices and cloud services. I knew quite a bit about distributed computing and so on. But my knowledge of how to program with some of the microservice-based databases, things like the Java Persistence API or the Jakarta Persistence API, or R2DBC, which is an asynchronous form, I just really wasn't up to speed with that. And I'd never felt before like I could take the time to go back and really master those topics. I didn't want to go back and get a master's degree in database programming. So till that point, I had really not been able to do that, to attack that domain, to learn it to the point where I could teach it. But using my good friend ChatGPT, I was able to learn enough about how the technology worked to get to the point where I could teach the material. And then I became quite good at it. and I used it as a learning aid that helped me accelerate my development much more rapidly than I ever could have done before. So that was my first real experience with the productivity boosts that you get by using these
So
tools.
that's really fascinating because what you just described is how we would want students to learn, right? How can I leverage ChatGPT to learn the material instead of just passing off an assignment? So
Yeah, so let's talk about
yeah,
that because
because
that's a
that's
fascinating
an
topic.
interesting conundrum, right? That we have in education.
So I'll tell you a funny story. About a year and a half ago or so, when ChatGPT was really starting to hit the mainstream from a pedagogical point of view in universities, we had a faculty retreat at the time. And I went off with one of my buddies who teaches our introductory courses. He teaches a data structures course, and he had really never tried to get up to speed with ChatGPT or LLMs, large language models. So I said, hey, Jerry, have you ever wondered how easy it would be for one of your students to take an assignment and then create a solution using one of these large language models? And he said, my assignments are really hard. I don't think they could do that. It would be really difficult. So I said, well, let's try this out. So I grabbed it. He sent me a PDF version of a 7-page assignment, a very
Oh
complicated
yeah,
assignment. It's one
yeah.
of the more advanced assignments for his data structures course. And I said, watch this. So I fed it into ChatGPT using the little attach files feature. And I said, please read this PDF file and then generate a solution based on what's in this program specification. And within about 5 minutes, it had generated a perfect solution. And just watching his expression as he suddenly realized his whole life was about to change. And I said, Jerry, isn't this awesome? Isn't this great? And he said, Doug, I think it may be time for me to retire. And so, but here's the funny part, Darren. So I thought at the time, I'm teaching advanced graduate level courses, advanced undergrad courses. These are really complicated, dealing with asynchronous, reactive network programming
Yeah,
with
those are tough
languages,
concepts.
very tough concepts. I didn't think it was something that I'd ever have to worry about in the foreseeable future. So then, literally 2 days before my first assignment was ready to be put out when the semester started, I decided to take my skeleton and run it through ChatGPT and see if it could generate a solution. And to my chagrin, it did. It generated an almost perfect solution in about a minute. And I thought, wow, now this is a problem. Before it was Jerry's
No,
problem.
it's
Now
your
it's my
problem.
problem. But what I learned from that, I learned two important things. The first thing I learned from that was by using ChatGPT, I could generalize and abstract my program assignments so they didn't give away as much of the solution and therefore weren't possible to be auto-generated by ChatGPT because I got more abstract. I didn't give people as many hints, I guess is
Yeah,
a good
yeah,
way to
yeah,
put
yeah.
it. So there were not as many clues to ChatGPT. And then because of that, I solved one problem, harder to cheat, but harder to grade and assess. So that's where we learned to use ChatGPT as a grader to then analyze the solutions the students gave us that were more free-form, more creative, harder to fit into the Procrustean bed of some linter or white box
Testing.
testing
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
apparatus that we
yeah.
had put in place. And that was the second piece. So ChatGPT made it harder for me at one level because I couldn't give as much hints as I used to, but it made it easier at another level because then I could assess the programs in a more automated way at scale without having to have an army of TAs help out.
So that brings up an interesting question I have for you, which is, did you now start thinking differently about the end goal? Because the end goal is not to have a perfect program from the student. The end goal is for the student to learn and master the concepts, right? And and I've
Absolutely.
talked to other teachers too. English. Imagine being an English teacher in college. Crazy, right? And I had a dear friend of mine that taught English, and she goes, I had to change the my whole mindset on how I evaluated a student's ability to master a subject. I could no longer just look at the content. I had to look at the process that they used to get to that content. And for her, it became a very different way of grading and scoring to help people understand, are you grasping this concept? Are you becoming a master at it?
Absolutely. And I think to kind of put a finer point on the excellent issues you're raising, what generative AI is doing is it's disrupting any field where the written essay, the written program, the written novel, the written solution is the means by which we assess and differentiate between people at different levels of capability. And if teachers like me and
Mhm.
you rely solely on the written product that is not produced in a way where you can keep track of every piece of that process, if, like, in other words, put people in a
Right.
room with no network and monitor them
And they're
with
using
eye tracking,
paper and pencil. Yeah.
going back to blue books and quill pens and so on. If we don't have that process, it's very disruptive to the way that we've had to think about assessment. In fact, one of the things I think is likely to happen as a result of this is we're going to go back to something where performance becomes part of the assessment process. So it's no longer enough to have the written means of communicating, it's performance. And what's kind of funny about this, if you look at other fields that have been disrupted by technology, music being a good example, when people in the 60s or so began to realize that you could spend lots of time in the recording studio fixing your mistakes and patching
Oh
in the
yeah.
problems and taking out things. Some people in the music community decided they were going to rebel against that model and go with improvisation. So you think about
Oh
jazz, for
yeah. Yeah.
example.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jazz is it's performance through improvisation. And to be considered an expert jazz pianist or guitarist or whatnot, you really have to be able to improvise. That's performance. And I think what's going to happen in the not too distant future is a lot more interviews are going to be based on people doing things live, not just providing some written sample of their work, which may or may not be
Your
their
work.
work.
Yeah. So well, that's interesting. So how would that look like in the university? That's going to take a
Lots of
lot
different
more
ways.
time, right?
Right. So that moves us to a more of a studio-based model. A lot of disciplines have a studio model.
Okay.
Obviously, people who are painters or
Or
people who are
musicians. Yeah.
trombonists,
Yeah.
dancers. So it's about performance, and you have a panel that evaluates the performance. That obviously doesn't scale up very well because you need an army of people
Yeah.
to
Yeah. Yeah.
review. However, once again, this is where AI and generative AI and LLMs can come back to help us out. So we can start to do assessments of recordings of things. And as the technology gets better and better, we'll be able to do assessments of the recordings in a multimedia sense. So once again, AI takes and AI gives. So it makes some things more complicated, but it also facilitates better review and
But
assessment.
it is a total paradigm shift for education, and it's not just going to be at the university levels. We're already seeing it in the high schools and even in the elementary schools. We're going to start seeing the same sorts of things. We've got to fundamentally change the way that we're educating and learning. I think this is where it really comes into is that learning model changes now.
Absolutely. And I think where it gets dicier is in earlier phases of the education process. For example, I teach primarily seniors and graduate students,
Right.
senior level students. By that point, at least heretofore, they already had a pretty good understanding of how to program and problem solve in the traditional ways.
Correct.
So they had built those skills. They knew how to debug. They knew how to do divide and conquer. They knew how to solve things by separating concerns. And so when I teach them and work with them using generative AI, they're building and amplifying on skills they already have. When we think about how do we teach the introduction to programming and problem solving
Yeah.
101 course, that's a much harder issue because a lot of these people don't even have the basic skills yet. And there's a temptation to outsource your brain to a large language model and never really fully understand what is going on. Now, sometimes that's good. If you think of the history of technology, especially of computer programming, it's been layers of
Of course.
abstraction.
Yeah. That's where we want to move to, right?
Nobody has to know how to do register allocation by hand anymore, and that's a good
Yeah,
thing.
it's a good thing.
But you do know how to have to know how to problem solve and how to think clearly, and that's where I think that the jury is still out on the best way to do this. I have a son who's in high school right now, and last year when ChatGPT first hit the streets, he was in a course where they were learning how to write sonnets and read sonnets, Shakespearean sonnets, and so on. And he really wanted to write sonnets, but his teacher decided that they would skip the graded sonnet module in the class because he was worried that people were going to use ChatGPT to generate the
Of course they
sonnets.
were.
But my son wanted to write sonnets, so he felt he was being robbed of the opportunity to actually learn how to express himself in that form. And that, I mean, that's a microcosm of a much bigger problem. How do you get this back into the very early phases of the education process?
It also, it's not just in education. We're also seeing it in industry as well. And I've noticed this myself because I use ChatGPT and several other models for a lot of programming that I do. And it's great because I don't have to learn an API that's already out there. I can just say, I need to use this API to do this sort of thing, spits out the code. But what I noticed was something interesting. I can look at the code and see if it's efficient, see if it does everything that I want it to do. And most of the time, I don't lift the code directly. I'm making changes to it because I understand my problem set so well. But I'm a gray haired programmer. I've been around a long time. But if I take a junior programmer, what are they going to do? They're just going to cut and paste that. They're not learning some of the key fundamentals that they need. So I see that there's a huge gap that's going to form where we have senior people or instructors that understand these concepts and these people coming up that won't understand them unless they're mentored. And so I think we need to move to more of a mentor mentee relationship because before I was forced to have a bunch of junior programmers to do the grunt work for me. Now ChatGPT can do the grunt work for me and it's cheaper. So we
Sure.
got a big problem that's coming. It's not here yet, but it will hit.
Well, think about all the technologies over the past 40 or 50 years that were tremendous at the time. I'll use the Saturn V rocket from the Apollo
That's a great
moon
example.
project.
Yeah.
There's really literally nobody alive today who understands how to make a Saturn V rocket and the engines and all the processes that went into building that. We've gotten to the point where we're doing amazing things, Blue Origin, SpaceX, and so on. But to go back and recreate that technology, very, very hard to do because it's just escaped us and nobody bothered to write it down.
Yes, I know, which
So
is
I think,
crazy. Just crazy.
and I think we're likely to have similar challenges with technology. People will forget how to do certain things. Now, as to whether that's a problem or not, really depends on the quality of the tools that we're using
Mhm.
to automate and replace human ingenuity, and also the way in which we learn to use those tools.
Well, it's like how many assembly programmers are there out there in the world today?
Right,
Active
right.
assembly programmers, not very many, right? Or
And that's because we taught compilers and optimizers
how to
and
do
so
it.
on how to do the work that they used to do.
Yeah. So is that all it is? Is we're just shifting up the abstraction levels?
There's a great quote by Edsger Dijkstra, who I think he might have said this in his Turing Award speech. He said, "The purpose of abstraction is not to be vague, but to define a new level where we can be absolutely precise." And I think that's what we're learning. And that's part of the challenge with generative AI at this point. We've not reached the point where we know how to be absolutely precise with this new level of abstraction. We don't know yet how to take the output from an LLM without a human and know whether it's providing something that's trustworthy, robust, sound, correct, et cetera, all the quality attributes that are so important. So as a result, we start into this model where people take it on faith. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't.
Right.
In the hands of experts, I suspect you and I probably have very few problems with hallucinations because we're careful in how we use the tools.
Right.
But I know a lot of people, especially some of my students, who would try to use ChatGPT less thoughtfully, and they had all kinds of problems with code that was wrong, it didn't compile. I didn't have those problems, but also I have decades of experience with problem solving and programming that they didn't have privy in their background at this
So
point.
so what it tells me is things that you and I have learned through hard knocks, because that's how we learned a lot of stuff. We were taught the theories, but then we went and did a lot of programs. We did a lot of projects. We learned through hard knocks what those theories really meant. We're going to have to change a way that we teach so that they can truly understand deeply those theories so that they can come up to speed faster using tools that will auto-generate code or auto-generate test suites. There's a whole bunch of interesting concepts. So we're going to have to change. We can't just ignore it and put our head in the sand.
That's right. And at the same time, a lot of people think of this as the end of the world.
Yeah, they
If you
do.
Google "is AI the end of humanity," you'll get endless hits on that. I don't. There are a lot of other things that keep me awake at night that are much more problematic in the world today than generative AI eating our brains. But it's going to change education for sure. And then, of course, education is sort of a leading indicator for the changes we're going to see in the economy, in business, government, defense, every other sector, healthcare, law. And so as people get through these experiences and learn this stuff, they're going to take it to the workforce with them. Now, the other thing I think is interesting, and I'm sure you can relate to this, those of us who've been out of school for a long time, even though I teach classes, I'm not always learning as much as I ought to. We have a way to be able to reskill ourselves very rapidly
Right.
in order to keep up with changes where that was really not easy and feasible, especially in a knowledge-centric career like we both have heretofore. You couldn't retool yourself on the dime the way you can now and get just-in-time skills that can be useful literally in a 5-minute period. When a task comes along that you're not sure how to address, you can leverage your chat buddy to give you an edge, kind of like an exoskeleton for your brain
Yeah.
that you just couldn't have done before.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So what I'm hearing from you now is, if I don't learn how to use these tools effectively, I'm going to be left behind.
So we've talked for decades about the digital divide, which was the people who had internet
Right.
network access and those who didn't. And I think we've gotten much better. You can sit in front of a Starbucks and solve the digital divide by getting free Wi-Fi.
Or McDonald's,
but we're about to
too, right? Yeah.
That's right. That's right. But we're about to hit what I call the digital chasm. And this is going to be people who know how to use AI productively and are using AI productively, and those who either won't or can't. And that is going to be a much bigger separation between the haves and the have-nots, if you will, because people who know how to use generative AI are going to be hundreds, if not thousands of times more productive, especially in knowledge-centric careers, than people who don't. And if people don't recognize that, it's going to put them at a huge disadvantage.
Thanks, Doug. If you enjoyed this episode, check out part 2 of this interview with Dr. Doug Schmidt. Thank you for listening to Embracing Digital Transformation today. If you enjoyed our podcast, give it 5 stars on your favorite podcasting site or YouTube channel. You can find out more information about Embracing Digital Transformation at embracingdigital.org. Until next time, go out and embrace the digital revolution.